Hello and welcome. This is News Club UK, a weekly panel show that doesn't just show the same old, same old. I'm your host, Thomas Barlow, and this week we are joined by Hilary Wainwright from Red Pepper, an independent, radical red and green magazine based in the United Kingdom. Desiree Reynolds, an author and journalist from Sheffield, going to be smashing it today. And Matt Kennard from Declassified UK, the leading news source for an in-depth analysis and exclusive news on British foreign policy, secret services, and the military. Really check them out. There's links in the description for all these guys. I want you to check them out. I want you to follow them. They're going to be great, even if I am an antagonistic, annoying so-and-so during this show, because I'm going to be taking the role of your host and the awkward interviewer. This week, we will be talking about a Guardian piece on the risk of systemic crises this winter, a Vice piece on the Penguin staff who are working against publishing Jordan Peterson's new book, and the British military working against Jeremy Corbyn. Let's start straight away. Let's get straight into it. Let's talk about, let's start with Hilary and talking about the Guardian piece. I'll just give you a little intro and then we're going to get straight into it. Okay, so UK facing risk of systemic economic crisis, official paper says. The government has privately admitted that the UK faces an increased likelihood of systemic economic crisis as it completes its exit from the European Union in the middle of a second wave of the coronavirus pandemic. A confidential cabinet briefing seen by The Guardian also warns of a notable risk that in the coming months, the country could face a perfect storm of simultaneous disasters, including the prospect of a bad flu season on top of the medical strains caused by COVID. Winter 2020 could see a combination of severe flooding, pandemic influenza, a novel emerging infectious disease, and coordinated industrial action against a backdrop of the end of the Brexit transition period, it warns. So we're joined by Hilary Wainwright from Red Pepper to talk about this. Hilary, isn't this just a stressing point? Isn't this just a civil service outline of the worst case scenarios that civil servants prepare for all the time? I think we need to turn you off mute if we can.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Oh.
No.
Yeah, we're on.
Okay. So, yes, I mean, in one sense, that's all it is on paper. But the fact that The Guardian makes it public, I think, is important because, in a way, these are documents governing or influencing government decisions. And they should be open and they should be debated and they should be part of the public argument. I think it's outrageous that, all these in a way, it's nothing new. I mean, you don't have to be terribly intelligent to kind of actually know that there's going to be these systemic crises. But in a way, the detail of the thinking of the civil service is important for us to know because that helps us both know what's influencing the government, know the options, and be better informed, better, forearmed, in order to actually hold the government to account. So I think it's important that it's been made public. So, good on The Guardian for that.
Guardian do a lot of stuff bringing lots of stories to light, but isn't this an example of sort of agenda-driven reporting? I think many would claim that this is the kind of non-story that's blown out of proportion just to make the government look bad, because that's what The Guardian like to do. They're not clearly fans of the Conservative government.
Well, I think it's not. I mean, journalism isn't just about judgment. It's also about information and the resource that information and knowledge can provide for citizens to take action and to think strategically, and also to, in a way, I was going to say to influence government, but that would presume we lived in a democracy, which we don't. And so, actually, the fact that we've got this information and people, got many thoughts about what could be done and how this crisis could be avoided, how ordinary people needn't suffer from the money that's had to be spent to address our health needs. But, there's no way in which the government's going to take account of public opinion other than if there's real pressure and real power. And so this kind of information helps us build that power and prepare for this kind of systemic crisis.
Well, we're talking about the crises. There's quite a lot of detail in the report and in the article. What do you think the key crises are? What are the major ones that were outlined there, and which to you seem most likely to be, to occur and to negatively affect us?
Well, I think interestingly, the ones that are listed are very much ones that imply that the threat is from the outside. So the pandemic, new diseases, the sort of problems of Brexit caused by other governments, caused by the EU. There's very little sense of what the government is doing that's contributing to those crises. So I think that the obviously the pandemic and the consequences of COVID for our health is a sort of overshadowing crisis. But also, we're aware that the government has handled this absolutely kind of, irresponsibly, right from the slowness of the initial lockdown, the kind of failure of the test and trace, the kind of lifting of the lockdown without any preparations for the test and trace other than, private contracts, which have proved to be a complete failure, as we could have predicted, because they're not using the knowledge of our public servants, particularly local government, the whole kind of public health infrastructure that exists in local government. So that's going to be an overriding shadow. But then also the consequences of COVID in terms of the economy is going to mean that people, in a way, it makes the health crisis worse because people are in such a precarious situation economically that they'll go to work even if they're sick. And this is going to be particularly true in the public sector. I'm not thinking so much of the health sector, but education and all the other parts of the public sector, which are so crucial in this crisis, but are not going to get the pay rise that they deserve. So I think the convergence of the economic crisis and COVID, and then obviously the economic crisis will be massively exacerbated by Brexit, which is an own goal by this government.
Well, I was going to ask before I bring everyone else in what you think the key causes for these crises will be. And I think you've talked about how it's being positioned as external factors. We're in the middle of COVID, and I think there are vast swathes of the public that give the government they say, well, no one would know what we're dealing with, and they give Johnson and the government a bit of leeway there. But there's other things like I saw.
They did. I'm not sure they do now. They did at the beginning.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, is this the case, you think? Because, for instance, I feel like there's also other things on top of COVID. For instance, Matt Hancock talked about how the British are peculiar in going back to work when they're ill. But then, if you look at comparative sort of sick pay rates to, say, continental Europe, Germans get 100% of their pay if they have sick days. We get around about 29%, and that's for those of us who are employed, because a great deal of us are self-employed and don't get any sick pay, and that's why people work when sick, and is particularly disastrous in a pandemic. Are there any other key causes that you can see for these potential crises that are coming, potentially coming down the line for us?
Well, I think perhaps the fundamental cause that must be placed at the foot of the government is the failure to use and develop the public sector and actually our public infrastructure, which is so which was invented and developed to save us from these kinds of crises, from health threats, from the instability of employment through the market. So the cuts in benefits, the sort of weakness of the furlough system, the way that a lot of precarious workers, self-employed workers, are not being helped. Many small businesses are not being helped. And then I think most fatally, the test and trace system, which, we know from other countries can work, it can be done, but this has all been put into the hands of a company, Serco, that actually, has got none of this accumulated knowledge that our public health infrastructure has at a local level. So I think it's, in a way, it's very ideological. I think it's this sort of belief in the market and the sort of and private enterprise that's meant that all our public capacities, including the capacities of the people. I mean, if you just think about all that mutual aid that's gone on, and actually, I was thinking as I was reading that article that maybe some of that, the lessons learnt during the COVID crisis and the public response to it, the public solutions that people have been inventing in the face of the government failure, could become quite important in dealing with the consequences of Brexit. For example, the food system, the food chains, clearly for many people they've not been adequate during the crisis, the health crisis. So people have turned to, local producers, all kinds of ethical and organic and sort of green kinds of production of local food, of chickens, of eggs, of of vegetables and so on. And there's a whole sort of new food chain emerging, which I think could be important in developing our resilience in the face of a completely irresponsible trade policy that's associated with Brexit.
Well, I think we'll get into Brexit a little bit, but I want to bring in the other guys first and foremost and just get their responses to this article and to these potential crises. Hello, Matt and Desiree. Matt, do you think this is a serious issue, or these potential crises are serious issues? And what do you think people can do about it in facing them?
Sorry, what specific crises?
Well, the potential that basically we could have overlapping crises of post-Brexit, the ones outlined in the article are
Right.
For instance, the post-Brexit food chains being broken and the shock to the economy from COVID, potentially an influenza pandemic, and also and something we experienced in the north and also in the southwest, floods and so forth as well. There's potential for all of those things to occur simultaneously, and they're quite reasonably, there's quite high potential of them,
Yeah, I mean, it's a massive worry. I think it's hard to really understand what the significance of all those different crises, because we don't get a picture of reality through the media. So, for example, with Brexit, obviously it's going to be a big rupture, but there has been years of it being used as a political football by both sides. The sort of the Remainer side has always said there's going to be this huge catastrophe at every different point along the Brexit since the vote, and it hasn't happened yet. But of course, it might happen. And then, of course, with coronavirus, we don't know the long-term impacts. I mean, we'll probably be living with this for generations. And then, of course, on top of that is climate change, which is the biggest problem of all. And actually, I think it's quite interesting that coronavirus. Hopefully, one good thing that will come out of coronavirus is it will change consciousness about climate change, because I think climate change has always seemed this abstract thing that's going to happen in the future that it's very hard to organize around in a sort of immediate way, because people can't conceptualize it as something that's going to affect them in the near term. And coronavirus is kind of one of the first, aside from economic shocks, but coronavirus is one of the first disasters that has really hit everyone's life across class, across every sort of boundary in society. So people don't feel they're insulated from crises in a way they probably did before coronavirus. So I'm hoping that shock to the system that coronavirus has given to the UK, but not just the UK, obviously the whole world, will really change consciousness and make people aware that even though we can't see it, well, we can see it in certain places, but we can't see it in an immediate sense here, it's coming and we need to prepare for it, and we need to do something now, because if we wait, and it hits in the way that coronavirus has hit, and it's going to be 1,000 times more of a crisis, because it's one we can't just easily find a vaccine to or reverse. It's going to be here with us forever and could be the next extinction. So yes, it's a major worry, but hopefully one good thing is consciousness has changed during this crisis, and we can use that to try and bring about some policies which might avert crises in the future.
Excellent. Well, I'd like to bring in Desiree here actually as well, and say, I think it would be fair to say, though, even though coronavirus has affected everyone, it's affected certain communities significantly more, and that disparity. Do you think that prepares us for these coming crises, or do you think we've got huge amounts of work to do? Oh, we need to turn you off mute.
I think we've still got a huge amount of work to do. I think the rhetoric around the virus, and one of the things that's been the most disingenuous, the most misleading, is the message that we're all in this together, and we really aren't. And as we can see from the stats and from the fact that so many people of color have been impacted by the virus, and I've, myself and family and friends, we've been to so many funerals, and people who aren't touched by it don't see it as anything. Otherwise, it wouldn't be spreading as much as it is and as much as it has been. So I think there's a huge amount of work to do. And just thinking about what Hilary said earlier on, which I very much enjoyed as well, but about maybe somehow we are now thinking about how we get our food, where we get our food from, and more thinking about it than we would do before the virus. Like, I've had reports of people talking about mutual aid still being racist. People couldn't get the food that they wanted. People promised to do some shopping and that they would help out an elderly West Indian person or an elderly African person, and they wouldn't do it. And they turned up at the door and then turned back around. And it's like COVID presents us this multi-layered issue that just keeps going and keeps going and keeps going. We haven't even touched the bottom yet.
Mm-hmm. Well, bring you back in there, Hilary, and everyone. I'd just like to get some final thoughts from you guys on what's been said here, because it seems to me that we face a lot of potential crises, both this sort of almost seemingly longer term one in climate change, which is affecting and killing people right now, but it's something that maybe we have some time to deal with a little bit. And then these ones coming around the corner. And that whilst there is some potential for new things to happen, we don't seem to be, as a society, maybe ready to deal with those crises. Would that be a fair assessment, Hilary, or do you think there's more cause for hope than pessimism?
I think it depends on us very consciously learning the lessons. I agree with Matt that some people have put it in terms of this is a dress rehearsal for climate change, and it is kind of leading people to be more aware of threats that come from human destruction of the environment, because this pandemic is a result of the exploitation of food chains and the link and animals and so on in China, but not particularly China per se, but globally. So I think there has to be a conscious learning, and one example, it can be a conscious use of the crisis, if you like. What's that word? Ingenuity breeds creativity. So I talked to some and wrote about some workers in the Airbus industry, in a company called Airbus, in the aircraft making industry, who were facing redundancies and layoffs because of the collapse of the plane travel of aviation, and they got involved in actually producing ventilators, and it was actually the unions that consciously organized to make that happen. And I think that is an example of where, if particularly the unions, but putting pressure on employers, could learn that lesson, and in the face now of the massive redundancies that are going to take place in the aviation industry. And after all, we don't want to be reconstructing the aviation industry in quite the same way. I mean, you know, one thing that could be done is the development of train systems in Europe, so we never had to fly to Europe. It is completely irresponsible, really, to fly, you know, such small distances when we could get a train perfectly well and very enjoyably. But there could be a whole sort of re-equipping of the health service using the skills and capacities of workers in the aircraft industry. Similarly, a lot of the wind power equipment, renewables equipment more generally, could be made by companies like Rolls-Royce and Airbus and so on. And I think, you know, talking to workers in Rolls-Royce who are now thinking in this kind of direction, and the experience of being involved in the production of ventilators gave them the, you know, help towards developing the idea that production systems could be different, and thinking critically about what they're producing, and in the face of redundancy, thinking, well, you know, we're not redundant. Our skills could be useful, but making something different. So I think whether or not there is this learning of lessons depends on our organizations and our ability to develop conscious strategies for preparing for climate change in the way that Matt outlines.
Yeah. Desiree, one of the things that occurs to me when Hilary's talking about unions and preparing organizations is this very key term, essential worker. And I think it's been a really interesting way to talk about the working class and the people who actually make society work. They are essential. I think COVID reveals that. But we're very quickly seeing from both the government and society at large that we can forget about a lot of those workers. You know, there has been pay rises for health staff, minimal ones. They're actually still below 2010 levels. But then you're looking at social care staff, majority workers who are immigrants or people of colour. You're talking about, I think one of the key networks, we've talked about it a little bit here, is food networks. The supermarket networks, the ways that we get our food are absolutely essential. Again, low wage workers, predominantly, again, people of colour, working class, you know,
and women.
And so do you think there's possibilities for unions, or where do you see changes that come on behalf of essential workers? Because clearly changes need to be made in support of them. We've only got an aging population. We're only still going to have more crises. We need to support them.
Yeah, I think one of the things that kind of, for me anyway, intersects all these different issues is race and gender, and how much more women of colour are affected by these crises, including the climate crisis, including the devastating climate disasters that happen mostly to the global south, that we here are very lucky to escape, but we know that it's not going to stay that way. And I think that unless we try and think about it in terms of where these oppressions intersect, then just kind of complaining about one thing without thinking about another thing isn't really going to get us that far. And we will still kind of maybe lack a forward-thinking approach to working these problems out.
Okay, excellent. And I'll just bring in Matt. I'm about to introduce your piece, Matt, but before I do you have any final thoughts on the piece that we've just discussed here, and some of these solutions and some of the problems that we're facing? Because Declassify UK specifically looks at foreign policy especially, and I think, you know, as has been mentioned, there's many crises that are going to face people of the rest of the world are going to face far worse, probably because of British foreign policy.
Yeah, I mean, I'll make a general comment on the sort of crisis narrative. Or I mean, firstly, I think the world's in crisis perennially. Like 3 million children die of malnutrition a year. That's a crisis. Yemen, 2 million children have been on the edge of famine for years. That's a crisis. What's presented as crises is political in itself. But I think what we need to understand is no crisis is an obstacle to change, to progressive change. In fact, it can be an opportunity. You know, the idea of Naomi Klein about disaster capitalism. We could have disaster socialism. it just depends about what the balance of forces are in any place. If we had a Corbyn government now, Brexit could be an amazing opportunity for progressive change, because you could lose all the reactionary stuff from Europe and keep all the progressive stuff, and then add in your own. So I think we need to look at each issue as a political problem, and our political system is in crisis because it's not democratic. It doesn't represent people. It represents corporations, and it represents small interest groups. If we could change that, all these crises would be, we could solve, or at least move towards solving them quite quickly, I believe. So I think that the left and progressives need to understand that this idea of an external crisis, which is out of our hands, can be useful to reactionary forces, because it gives them it lets them off. And I mean, on the economic stuff, I think that's especially the case, because you see often it's like that phrase Tony Benn had, which is, they can always find money for war, but they can't find money to feed kids. And essentially that's true. And you're seeing it now. Overnight, Boris Johnson promised 16.5 billion more funds to the UK military. Meanwhile, he had to be shamed into just allowing kids to have free school meals during holiday season, which was what, a couple of million quid, or definitely not much. So it's all about priorities. And if we had the right priorities, we could move forward. But our whole political system is built, and we'll come onto this now with discussion of the article which I chose, is built to stop any kind of figure or any kind of movement that might challenge the system, that doesn't allow democracy or doesn't allow a redistribution of wealth and power.
Yeah, I think that's a good segue to the next bit, which I will introduce the next article. And all the articles are in the link. Please do check them out. And also join the News Club UK, follow us on all the socials and all that good stuff. News Club UK, we're on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. And we have a Telegram channel where we hit you 3 times a week with the top independent news from around the UK. So do sign up for that. Do stay in touch with us. And also get in the comments. We'd love to get your comments in, and I'd love to read them out as well. So I think one of the things that everyone touched upon there is about the UK being a democracy or not being a democracy. And to many people, that would seem a weird statement. We have elections, right? Are we not a democracy? I think this next article helps us get into that discussion, and that's something I'm going to ask all of our guests about, but specifically Matt, after asking him, of course, some awkward questions, channeling Andrew Neil. So here's the piece. How the UK military and intelligence establishment is working to stop Jeremy Corbyn become Prime Minister. This is a story from 2019. The article from December 2019 states, officials in the UK military and intelligence establishment have been sources for at least 34 major national media stories that cast Jeremy Corbyn as a danger to British security, new research shows. The stories, which quote former or current members of the Army, Navy and Special Forces, as well as MI5, MI6 and an ex-senior civil servant, have averaged 1 every 6 weeks since Jeremy Corbyn was elected leader of the Labour Party in 2015. There have, however, been significant spikes in frequency during the 2017 and 2019 general election campaigns. There is a strong suggestion that for some stories, intelligence officials have themselves provided secret documents to journalists as part of what appears to be a campaign. Every story has been picked up across national print media, often setting the news agenda and chiming with statements from the Conservative government ministers. Nearly every story appeared in 4 papers: the Daily Telegraph, the Times, the Daily Mail or the Sun. Our research also found 440 articles in the UK press since September 2015, specifically mentioning Corbyn as a, quote, threat to national security. The intelligence services and the military are supposed to abide by the constitutional principle of non-involvement in political affairs. But the numerous instances of serving national security officials briefing against Corbyn in the media raises questions about whether this principle has been upheld. So, Matt, I've got to start off with this one. It's an article from December 2019. Isn't this old news? I mean, why is this relevant now?
It's a good question. And I think that the answer is the kernel of the answer is I don't think you can really understand systems until they stop working as they should, or at least you can't visibly understand them. So we don't really understand. Going back to your question about is Britain a democracy, it can seem like it's a democracy when everything is run as they want it to, i.e. you have two sort of factions of the same political party vying for power. So Labour under Blair, the Tories under Cameron. That's all fine. Everyone can go out to vote. No one has to worry. But when someone like Jeremy Corbyn appears, which is a very rare instance in terms of becoming a leader of a major political party in the West, an anti-imperialist socialist, you see these people have to come out of the shadows because the system stops running as they like it to. And I think what happened to Jeremy Corbyn is a lesson that we all need to learn, because those lessons, we don't get to learn them very often. And in terms of the story that I mentioned, which I actually wrote, it shows that when the going gets tough and their interests get threatened, these institutions, which we're told are neutral and about defending us and our country, i.e. the military and the intelligence services, that's not their role. And these are important revelations because they have huge amounts of power in our political system, number one. Secondly, they're nearly completely secret. In terms of the MI5 and MI6, they are completely secret. There's a degree of transparency with the military itself, but the intelligence services, we don't know anything about what they do. So then when you start to understand that we have these huge edifices which are acting in a political way to ensure the interests of the elite, and they bypass democracy and mess around with democracy in a completely unaccountable way, then it's an important thing for the left to learn. And I think that the reason I chose it now is you're seeing with Jeremy Corbyn now, I think the denouement of a campaign which has been rolling since 2015, and it's carrying on because he's still a threat. He isn't a threat in terms of actual power because he's not Labour leader anymore, but he's a threat as an example. And what's happening to him now is they have to destroy him as an example, because if he gets to survive and he's still a symbol, it means that that could happen again. And young politicos who want to be politicians or join the Labour Party and rise up the ranks, they'll look at him as an example and try and copy him, and they don't want that at all. So the suspension from the Labour Party, the removing of the whip, it's all part of this process, and everyone and parts of the left seem to be surprised that Starmer is doing this, but Starmer is a representative of the British establishment, in my view. And he is part of this process, which is just trying to obliterate the idea that progressive change can happen in the UK. And in fact, I think that what we saw from 2015 to 2019 showed that under the current system, well, I'm talking about the media, the deep state, the intelligence services, the military, I don't think we can have a progressive leader rise up. It's impossible. Because even if Corbyn had won, can you imagine what would have happened then? The ferocity of the attacks, and he wasn't even in power, that would add to that the fact that he makes decisions and is in control of our military, number one. Secondly, imagine coronavirus. Any little mistake that they'd made, which would have been inevitable, would have been exaggerated beyond belief. So he wouldn't have lasted months. Now, that's a huge problem for us as progressives. And I think that the left and people, at least who want a more humane and just foreign policy, and I think mainly the attacks on Corbyn were about foreign policy. I think that they need to get an awareness of what's called parapolitics, which is often people don't want to get involved in because they don't want to be called conspiracy theorists, or they don't want to be seen as people who believe in shadowy forces that might or might not exist. But in fact, that's a way of stopping people actually looking at and analysing a whole section of society which has huge amounts of power. And I think any tactics and strategies we come up with to bring about progressive change in the UK has to include an analysis and a discussion of the power of the deep state. And by the deep state, I'm talking about specifically the intelligence services and the military. So it remains relevant, and we're kind of seeing the denouement of a process which I think the article deals with, but is ongoing. And that also relates to foreign powers as well, because we haven't got any hard evidence that the Israeli government has been working against Jeremy Corbyn, but that he's the first pro-Palestinian leader that's risen up to a position of power in the Western world. You would imagine, knowing what most intelligence agencies are up to, there would have been some reaction to that. So, but But again, that's on the left. We can't talk about that because people are scared to. And I think that what needs to happen is we need to kind of understand that without an analysis of this, what's being done to Corbyn will succeed, and we won't even have the vocabulary to fight back.
I've actually got two interesting comments here, which are going to be lead into what was going to be my next question. So thanks, guys, for both thinking like my questions and also getting involved in the comments. So Michael Coleman says he did not need any help from the military. He did it all by himself. And James Poisman says Brexit needs to happen. Corbyn had no chance of election because he opposed a proper Brexit. Government forcing lockdowns is not right as well. It is all disastrous. But in regards to that, this is what both of those kind of lead to a question that I was going to ask, which isn't this the kind of victimhood that the left always indulges in? I mean, did this really make any difference to his election chances? Wasn't he just an unlikable kind of weird guy who was on the wrong side of Brexit? Isn't that why he lost? And isn't that really the lesson that we should take from this?
No, I don't think it is. I think that we need to kind of zoom out from the immediate situation, which is Jeremy Corbyn, and we need to look at what this tells us in a wider way about British society, because it's not going to be Jeremy Corbyn the next time this happens, but the same forces that are protecting the same interests will be activated again. So we need to have some kind of analysis and awareness of at least of their existence. And it's also an outrage because, as you mentioned in the article that you outlined at the start, these institutions, I mean, we don't have a constitution, but in terms of the unwritten constitution, everyone operates on the understanding that the military and intelligence services don't interfere in the domestic political system. I mean, of course, they overthrow governments all over the world all the time, but in terms of the domestic system, they're meant to stay hands off, and they don't. And they pretty much can get away with not interfering at all, usually, as I mentioned, because they don't have their interests threatened. Keir Starmer's not a threat. You're never going to see them briefing against Keir Starmer. You wouldn't have seen them briefing against Tony Blair because they are part of the same system. But the point is, we need to understand that these interests exist. We need to understand that they will activate themselves if they get threatened. So I think that Corbyn, as great as he is in terms of what he's put up with, he's not the issue. The issue is our society and what barriers exist towards progressive change. And anyone who wants to bring about progressive change, I feel, needs to understand this whole area.
Right. Well, I want to bring in Hilary and Desiree on this. It's a big topic, and I guess it, rumbling on in the background of the internal divisions in the Labour Party. But this story's trying to talk about what the establishment looks like in the UK. And Hilary, I know that you've been looking to write around this and so forth, and I'd love to get your opinion. What does this tell us about the establishment in the UK, and what do you think about what Jeremy Corbyn represents?
I think that one has to bring in here the Labour Party's relationship to this establishment. I think it's important to know that right from the beginnings of the Labour Party, though they've had and now continue, well, many Labour Party people defend the link with the unions, which is the Labour Party's progressive, dimension. But the other side of that is a complete deference to our existing political system. So built into their founding statement in 2006, and then again in 2017, or 2018 rather, was an explicit statement that all the policies of the Labour Party, public ownership and so on, could be achieved through the existing state. Now, I think that's been shown not to be the case, and I think Matt's right here. I think it's not. I mean, I would, and I'm sure he'd agree that I would go beyond the question of the military to the question of the Treasury and its relationship to the city, and how that was decisive in, for example, defeating the ideas of Tony Benn around democratizing public ownership, so that there's a kind of systemic bias in the nature of the British state, which is to do with its unwritten constitution. I mean, we all know from our own kind of experience of organizations that when the rules aren't written, it's the powerful, the elites whether, particularly the unelected elites, that benefit because they make up the rules as they go along, because there's no sort of rules that they need to abide by. So I think that being able to address the role of the military and also the role of the city requires the left to be part of a movement for democratic change. I think this is coming actually at the moment from Scotland, from what could be the breakup of Britain. And I think we're going to see the workings of the establishment. Certainly be good to watch Matt's declassified organisation investigate, the ways in which the establishment will work against the breakup of Britain, because it'll mean the breakup of the challenging of the military, the nuclear Trident, which is based in Scotland, Faslane, the breakup of the Treasury. I mean, it'll break up these highly centralised. Britain's a highly centralised country. That's another aspect of its lack of democracy. The fact that local government has no written power. I mean, I used to work briefly at the GLC. I coordinated a unit called the Popular Planning Unit, which was about popular participation in economic policy. And what happened? The GLC was abolished. When I remember talking to people in Canada and other countries, and they couldn't believe, that the government had the power to abolish a layer of government. And the reason for that is because there's no written constitution. Local government has no rights. So I finally say that a lesson for us on the left is that I feel we kind of should have thought this through a bit more, that in a way we all found ourselves working our guts out to get Jeremy elected, with a kind of naive belief that electoral politics was enough, even though intellectually we knew it wasn't. And I just think we've got to have a bit of lesson learning ourselves in order to be more strategic in how we approach a new opportunity for the left, which I agree with Matt is likely to come because Jeremy has left a legacy which they're now trying to destroy.
Yeah. And I'm going to bring Desiree in here. What do you think about this? I think there was a lot of nodding along with what Hilary is saying in the backstage area. And for my part, I'd like to say if if the state is a weather vane, I'd rather be the wind and change its direction from outside personally. But I'd love to hear what you think about everything that's been said here.
I kind of agreed with everybody really. I know. But I kind of felt like the idea that when what Matt was talking about, which is incredibly important about these deep dark forces that are working to undermine what we think of might be democracy and what we think of might be our rights, has always happened for certain communities. I know I sound like a broken record, but it really has. Like somebody dying in police custody, a black and brown person, a Muslim person, somebody dying in police custody, trying to get justice for that relative that's died. They cannot, because the weight of the police are upon them. That nobody listens to them, nobody hears them. And that's what I mean about that these forces have always been there and working against certain communities more than others. And now we see that it's kind of working against everybody. In terms of Jeremy Corbyn, and the Labour Party, I mean, the Labour Party continue to engage in this kind of neoliberalistic policy project that kind of started with Blair. It keeps going, and I think it's the triumph of individualism, and that's what defeated Corbyn. That people felt personally attacked. They thought that we're going to have something was being taken away from them, which kind of neatly segues into what I'm going to be talking about in a bit. But that he couldn't succeed because he was thinking more about community than he was about individualism. And that's a sad indictment of where we are right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see that very much. Not that I'm saying this now to butt you up, because we're now going to go on to the next segment where I'm going to be imagining tin cans flying at me as I ask some of the worst questions I've ever written for this show. So I'm looking forward to the fire that I'm going to get. I think that was a really interesting discussion. Again, check out Declassified UK's work, check out Red Pepper, check out News Club UK. I've got to do these little shout outs in between. And let's move on to the final piece that we're talking about today, which is Desiree Reynolds has picked out a piece from Vice. So let's pull it up. And it is Penguin Random House staff confront publisher about new Jordan Peterson book. Several Random House Canada employees confronted management about the company's decision to publish a new book by controversial Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson at an emotional town hall Monday, and dozens more have filed anonymous complaints, according to 4 workers who spoke to Vice World News. Quote, "He is an icon of hate speech and transphobia, and the fact that he is an icon of white supremacy, regardless of the content of his book, I'm not proud to work for a company that publishes him," a junior employee who is a member of the LGBTQ community and who attended the town hall told Vice World News. They said one co-worker discussed how Peterson had radicalized their father. The company since June has been doing all these anti-racist and allyship things, and them publishing Peterson's book completely goes against this. It just makes all of their previous efforts seem completely performative, the employee added. So, Desiree, before I get really awkward, let's just open this up. You know, let's just open it up with a couple of things that set this up. You know, why is this story important, and who is Jordan Peterson, and why did the staff have a problem? Because some of these things might not be obvious to everyone. He does fulfill a niche, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does. So Jordan Peterson, well, I'll start with why I think it was important. Obviously, as a writer, and as a Black woman writer, I thought that it was important to think about who gets published, who gets to write what. I think that's probably one of the key things that I felt was quite important about looking at this, and looking about the state of publishing, and looking at perhaps what we think about workers' rights as well. So I'll go on to that in a minute. So Jordan Peterson, he is the poster boy for kind of white male victimhood, kind of incels wingman. He wrote a book in 2016, I believe, called 12 Steps of Just Being Who He Is, and how he feels that his life is being eroded. His way of life is being eroded and being gotten rid of. So he's a lecturer, a Canadian lecturer, that one of his students wanted to refer to themselves as they and them, and he refused. He's a biological determinist and wanted to stick to that and refused to call the student that, which is why the arguments are that he's transphobic. And since then, he's made himself a YouTube career in talking about why he feels that his way of life, being white and being male, is somehow being eroded. And he wrote this book, which sold millions, of course it did, made himself a fortune, and has since been in rehab in Russia. Anyhow, the point being that I thought was quite interesting, again, about what it is that gets written. And I think the article itself is weirdly badly written too. Like the emphasis on the fact that workers were crying somehow is that compassion is a weakness, and therefore have you got a point if you're crying and if you're weak. I didn't really like that. And the idea that it felt a little bit like it was being fueled by toxic masculinity, really. Oh, they actually cried about this guy, and oh, it's all a little bit gaslight and it shouldn't be happening. Anyhow, the other thing that I really, really took heart from this was that workers were trying to hold their company, this institution, their employers to account. And how do we do this? How do we effectively do this? And obviously, I know that we can go on to that in a bit, though, but we know that Penguin may or may not change their minds about publishing him or not. But I liked the idea that somehow these workers were going to try and say, this is what is the problem with this, and whether or not, whether or not Penguin will listen, we'll see. I doubt it, but I appreciated the fact that they tried.
Right. And it's an interesting point you talk about the workers there and the workers taking umbrage with this, because Peterson has built a career on YouTube, as you say, as part, not always directly as part of the alt-right, but certainly associating enough with the alt-right figureheads like, name them. I'm not even going to name them. Sodom. They don't deserve the publicity, and I can't remember who they are.
Fine.
It's knobheads, right?
Yeah.
But you know, their key thing, their key standpoint, and this is the awkward question. This is the first of the shitty questions I ask you, is that they see themselves as victims of this sort of liberal anti-free speech hand-wringing. You know, that is, you know, as you say, it's or everyone's getting emotional about us just laying down some facts or just laying down our opinions, and we're allowed to say our opinions. You know, how dare you stop us from being able to publish in a global publisher, like, you know, or from being on YouTube? You know, isn't this an example of that? And if it is, you know, is that a good or bad thing? You know, does that actually feed his base?
It doesn't take much to feed his base, but I feel as though people who scream the loudest and the most about free speech have loads. I don't see people seeking asylum screaming about freedom of speech. I don't see people who are suffering from the hostile environment. I don't see as many Black women, brown women screaming about freedom of speech. It seems to be the people screaming about freedom of speech have a lot. And what they're really talking about isn't that they're being silenced, because I hate that. I think we need to talk about language when we're engaged in this kind of topic of conversation. But what they really are talking about is that they're being ignored or being looked over, or they're going to have to think about what they mean when they talk. Wow. I mean, most of us have to do that. Most women have to do that. Most people of color have to do that. So for the kind of idea for him that he then has to do that, and it's horrible, it's awful, I'm being silenced, is quite frankly ridiculous.
Okay. Well,
I was thinking there, Tom. I could have been worse, but I was now.
You know, like I say, I was expecting the stuff coming up my head. I'll just wait for your crew to mob me at some other point.
Okay.
Yeah, it's okay, man. You know, I can take it. So one of the quotes from the article, the response by Penguin was this. They said, "We are open to hearing our employees' feedback and answering all of their questions. We remain committed to publishing a range of voices and viewpoints." Isn't this a pretty reasonable position from the publisher, like from especially a publisher? Isn't it important that they remain committed to publishing a range of views, of voices and viewpoints, and at the same time listening to their employees?
Well, yeah, I guess if that's what actually is happening, but we know that that isn't. The idea that they are somehow being, this is the performative wokeness, isn't it? Like, we all put up our black squares when George Floyd died in the summer, and it comes back to this now, where something actually has to happen. We have to put your money where your mouth is. And Penguin isn't going to, I don't believe Penguin, which is a huge, massive company, and this is Penguin Canada, by the way, because they have so many different arms, whether or not they do this. Now, the fact that they wanted to listen, or they've said they're listening to their employers' views, I think that's quite interesting, because beforehand they didn't have to even pretend to be listening. So now that they're pretending to listen, I think that's quite important to kind of think about. And I go back to what I didn't mention before, was like I was going back to the idea of workers kind of trying to hold the companies to account, like the Lancaster mill workers, or like the workers who refused to do the jet engines for Pinochet. That was, I forgot where that was, but it was the fact that these people felt like they could do something about their working rights. And that, I thought that at least if Penguin are kind of trying to look like they're listening, then it means that they know that we are all watching. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And they may be aware that everyone's watching, but aren't we in a world where everyone does watch? You know, isn't there a feeling that there are Twitter mobs out to attack you for anything days. And I mean, it's something we see, particularly people who've platformed him, like Joe Rogan or maybe Dave Chappelle, who, you know, American examples. There's London Real in the UK who do similar things, who say, listen, you know, we're just about to get attacked, you know, for anything, and Twitter mobs will destroy us, will destroy your right to hear the truth. And again, do you not feel like there's a difficulty in balancing solidarity with in a world where, for instance, with the Passaran guys from Scotland who didn't build weapons that were supporting a fascist dictatorship,
right?
That's direct solidarity. And we heard from Frankie Boyle earlier in the week. He said, like, solidarity has become kind of this left-wing thoughts and prayers. Where's the actual action? You know, what are we looking for here? And I'm going to ask you this and bring in the other guys after I hear your response.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we don't do, and I appreciate what Frankie Boyle said, it's true. Solidarity costs, equity costs, and this is and Jordan Peterson represents the idea that he doesn't want anything to cost him anything. He wants things to stay the same, which keeps him at the top and makes him unaccountable. But solidarity is work. It's real hard work. And as the other two speakers in their own fields know, that it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, and it also takes a lot of money, which is what people, elitist structures, are not happy to let go of.
Okay, so I'm going to bring in the other guys right now. So this can be like one of those hot button topics for a lot of people. So who better to talk about it than, you know, some of the communities who are not involved. I'm going to start off with you, Matt, looking at no one in particular. What do you think to this? Do you think these, if you read the Vice article, you will have noticed, I think Desiree was right to point out that there was talk of crying, and that like emotional honesty was then tied to particular communities. That do you think that this is an overblown case, or that the workers are right to like try and take this on?
It's complicated, isn't it? Because yes, I guess in a democratic workplace, the workers should have a say on what their company does. We don't have very democratic corporations, but in theory, I agree with that. On the other hand, I do think that it's a slippery slope if you start allowing what gets published to reflect what certain people in certain publishing houses feel about that work. If that's the criteria, then it's I think that it could be used against all sorts of, it could be used against the left eventually, because often these things first come about in attacks on uncouth views and views which are quite reactionary, and then the same tools are used then against the left. It's like social media censorship. Everyone cheers when some reactionary is muted, but then those same tools are then used to take off, like Tel Azur is being taken down from Twitter relentlessly, and other independent media outlets. So I think it's a slippery slope. I also think that, as important as this issue is, and Jordan Peterson, I don't have any time for his views, obviously, but I mean, was anyone crying when the publishing house published Tony Blair's book, The Journey, or whatever it's called? This guy is responsible, and George Bush's autobiography. These people are probably responsible for probably the biggest crime of the 21st century, the invasion of Iraq, which killed 1 million people and absolutely destroyed a whole society. And they're still invited on Sky News and all the corporate news channels. I wonder if the people in those news channels start crying when they're told that their producers have arranged for them to come on. I don't know. I just feel like the focus so much on these cultural war issues is about it, in some ways is a result of the corporate controlled societies we live in, where they want people to constantly talk about these issues. I'm not saying they're not important. I need to say that, because obviously especially minority struggles, I'm not talking about minority struggles for their rights, but I'm talking about the sort of liberal use of it, the instrumentalization of it by sort of neoliberal liberal institutions. I think that it's problematic and makes everyone obsess about these issues and ignore wider issues, such as I mentioned, the fact that we've got like war criminals in our midst that are actually paraded on TV as respected voices, and no one even brings a tiny a bit of dissent against these people appearing. I mean, it even goes for the left too. I was really disappointed during the build up to the last election when John McDonnell sat down with Alistair Campbell for a pally chat with GQ. And I mean, the funny thing is, Alistair Campbell would be no platform by the left if it said something against trans people, which you can argue that for that case, but he's not no platform by the left for being responsible for lying a country into a war which killed 1 million people. So I just think it's a priorities thing. I'm not, so it's complicated. I would say that democracy is good. Identity politics in terms of people's struggles for their rights is good. The liberal, neoliberal version, I have a problem with.
Right, well, we should have opened up the show with this because we're now clearly going to get ourselves into a fucking fist fight. Man, my French. What you're talking about, Desiree, I believe, is like the equality of access and freedom of speech, maybe in certain areas. And you know, again, if we looked at workplace democracy, if Penguin or publishers were run by workers, then why shouldn't they have the right to decide what they publish? The print workers tried to do that. They refused to print a front page with that made Arthur Scargill look like Hitler by the Sun under Murdoch, right? Ultimately, you want to be responsible for the work that you do in the world, and you want to have ownership over it. And if if you can't get published by that organization, then you have to then find your own organization that will publish you. Shouldn't we be looking towards more equality of access, more power in the hands of both workers and marginalized communities in order that they can platform their own voices? And in doing so, that is an economic argument towards solving also something that is a cultural argument as well. Desiree.
Oh. I was just going to say exactly that hand wave was me going, yeah, okay. Exactly what I was talking about. And I appreciate that people have issues that touch them deeply on many, many levels. But I also appreciate that if we do not understand how they touch other people, then we can't, those solidarities that are needed, it can't happen. It can't happen without us thinking about what other people may think or feel like. So the idea that somehow, again, that we go back to that kind of whataboutery, it's not useful. It's not useful. And if we don't think about movements in terms of like working in conjunction with, then I can't see it changing rapidly.
Okay, well, I'm going to bring in Hilary to chat and take us through to the end, I think, in superb fashion, as you have been so far all the way through. So can you share with us your thoughts on this issue and the discussion that we've had so far?
Okay, I mean, I've not got a sort of absolutely kind of dogmatic position on these things, but I think first, let's be clear about two things. Firstly, Penguin, is a profit-driven company. Gordon Peterson, whose views I'm not even interested in, actually, really. I mean, I certainly don't agree with them. But, he's, as Desiree said, is incredibly popular. So a book by him is going to make a lot of money for Penguin. Now, they say they produce a range. Certainly in the past, this was sort of around about 68, they did produce, under a brilliant editor called Neil Middleton, very good sort of socialist, radical, critical books. But I mean, I doubt if at the moment they'll be producing a book that'll give an alternative view of US or Canadian politics to that of Jordan Peterson, because it's not very popular. It's not going to sell. It's not going to bounce off the shelves. So I think that the workers are right to sort of raise the issue. And I mean, I think on the question of workers' control, I mean, Red Pepper is thinking about being a co-op, but it won't be a workers' co-op. It'll be a multi-stakeholder co-op because I think that it's not, in a way, democratic just for journalists to decide what's produced. It also should involve readers and people who've got a sort of wider goal. We were set up by a socialist movement, and so they play a part in our board. And so, I think workers' control has got to involve some notion of popular control. Same with, public services that need to be much more democratic, but it would be about users as well as workers. So I think that's important. I think on the issue itself, I mean, this question of people being a victim of identity politics, I think is rubbish. I mean, the situation facing white working class people in the US is they're not victim of identity politics. They're a victim of economic markets. I mean, there's a brilliant sort of podcast, I think part of a book by David Harvey, part of a book called Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, where he talks about, he quotes Roosevelt talking about necessitous men not being free men, and compares it with Marx talking about a move from the realm of necessity to the realm of freedom. And in a way, many of the workers in the Rust Belt and the areas hit by the destruction of jobs and the destruction of manufacturing industry are people who are not free men or free women. They're the product of necessity. And in that situation, all kinds of prejudices and scapegoating can emerge, because they're not in a context of freedom, debate, ideas, and all the sort of conditions of liberal, let alone socialist democracy. So I just think that Jordan Peterson's views are misdirected, and we've got to think not just in terms of identity politics, but also class and economic politics, and how the two interconnect. I mean, I'm a feminist, and identity is important, but it's not sufficient. So, I mean, I would never say that because I'm a woman, everything I say about being a woman is right. I think there needs to be investigation beneath the surface of experience into the sort of deeper structures of inequality that shape being a woman, being a man, being black in a capitalist society. So, I just reject a sort of blaming of identity politics for all our problems.
Fantastic. I personally thought that was a perfect note to end on, particularly because it gives me a segue into a little plug. But before I do, Matt or Desiree, should we continue this afterwards, or is there anything you'd like to say to the audience before we go? No, I'm gonna assume I can segue on then. Okay, guys, give me a one shot, because this has been fantastic, and this is us platforming and introducing speakers and people that we want to see more of, and this has been made possible by Now Then, who we're working with, Opus Independence, who run the Festival of Debate, and I would check that out. It's absolutely fantastic, and all of Now Then's work is. And then I want to give a plug for the organization I'm part of, which is the Media Fund, which is a multi-stakeholder cooperative. That means if you join us as a donor, you become a member, and the board is elected equal parts, the workers, media partners. We work with around about 40 reputable, trustworthy, independent news media partners, including some of the people you've heard today and we've referenced today, and the donors. We all get our voices heard, and we all shape what we're trying to do. And what we're trying to do is promote independent, trustworthy, independent news and get it out to wider audiences, make it financially sustainable, especially so voices from the working class, communities of colour and women who very rarely get their voices heard in the media actually get to be heard, because they're actually getting paid to do the labour they always end up having to do unpaid, or that is usually shut off due to a lack of access for not being able to do unpaid labour. So please help us build a sustainable, powerful, independent news media scene. Join the Media Fund. Check out the link in the description, or check out themediafund.org. Check out the links in the description. Check out our Telegram. Check out all that good stuff. Like, subscribe, hit that bell button if you're on YouTube. It means you actually hear about us. You want to hear about what's going on, and help us make this show a regular thing after Christmas, because we've only got 3 more shows left, and they're going to be fantastic. And we've already had 3 fantastic shows. If you haven't seen the previous ones, check them out. that's me burbling on. It's enough for me. It was great to hear from everyone today. I really enjoyed the chat, and I really value all of these people's work, so please check them out. We'll catch you on the next one. Thanks very much for joining us.